From the Bloomberg Washington, D.C. Bureau to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in for David Weston. The August jobs numbers are out and unemployment went up unexpectedly while payrolls added more than analysts predicted last month. We'll get reaction directly from the White House this hour. President Biden issues a warning to the nation about the so-called MAGA wing of the Republican Party. We'll get thoughts coming up from Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin. And the Pentagon says Iran tried to capture an unmanned American vessel in the Persian Gulf. We'll talk about the risk level with former Defense Secretary Mark Esper. All that and more coming up on Balance of Power right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
And we start this hour with a closer look at those August job numbers. The headline certainly stronger than expected with 315,000 jobs. The unemployment rate ticking up unexpectedly, not by a lot, to 3.7%. And a lot of talk, a lot of focus on the labor participation rate also rising as more people start looking for work. We dig into this a bit more now with Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who has been poring over the numbers since the release at 8:30 a.m. Michael, thanks for being here. Is this the report the Fed was praying for?
This is the second month in a row I've said if you were going to be writing a report for the Fed, this is the numbers that you would like to have used. Going inside that list of numbers that you had right there, that participation rate, 62.4%. Remember how many jobs have shown up in the JOLTS surveys unfilled? Well, if you're going to get more people into those jobs, you need more people in the labor force, and they do seem to be coming back. 738,000 in the last month came into the labor force, which is why the unemployment rate went up. So if the unemployment rate went up under those circumstances, it's relatively good news. Pay was still up, although moderating a little bit, so maybe a little bit of pressure off the inflation rate. And that's had an effect in the Fed funds futures markets in terms of what the Fed's going to do in September and in terms of what the Fed is going to do for its terminal rate. Right now, we're down a little bit from the midpoint. Sort of leaning towards a 50 basis point move in September. That would make things a little bit easier on the Fed and a little bit easier on the administration. And speaking of that, I have to show you this because, as they say in politics and showbiz and sports, timing is everything. President Biden and the Democrats came into 2022 with a lousy economy and things going downhill, but it's all sort of changed around. The Atlanta Fed GDP Now numbers show growth in the current quarter. We now see a rising number of people on payrolls. The consumer price index has started to go down. And as you can see, the yellow line there, the generic congressional poll about people's favorites for the for the congressional race in the midterms is turning in favor of the Democrats. So if it holds, this is going to be good news for the administration as well.
Fascinating take on this, Michael. We seem to have reached the Goldilocks moment. Is it fair to say that the Fed gets what it wants, the stock market gets what it likes too?
Yeah, but in Goldilocks, everybody lived happily ever after. This is 1 month. We don't know what's going to happen next month. So the Fed and the president and the Congressional Committee for the Democrats can enjoy it for today, but keep their fingers crossed for the month of September.
Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Thank you, Mike, for setting us up with some important numbers here today. President Biden delivered a fiery speech last night, a primetime address to the nation, attacking Donald Trump and so-called MAGA Republicans. He spoke from Philadelphia.
MAGA Republicans have made their choice. They embrace anger. They thrive on chaos. They live not in the light of truth, but in the shadow of lies. But together we can choose a different path. We can choose a better path.
But President Biden's intensified anti-Trump message also risks deepening America's political divisions. It's a national conversation, and we want to bring in Governor Glenn Youngkin from Virginia for more on this. Of course, one of the most notable post-Trump Republicans on the national stage who's been traveling the country to help raise money for Republican candidates. Governor, thank you for being with us once again on Balance of Power. You heard the president last night. He made clear that the MAGA wing, as he calls it, the ultra MAGA wing of the Republican Party, is a threat to democracy. Is he right?
I was stunned at how divisive this speech was last night. And at a time where people across America, and I know in Virginia, are worried about some of the most basic issues, rising inflation and trying to make ends meet, crime, and oh, by the way, education challenges. And it's a time when, in fact, we've got to focus on these issues. And our president jumped out and was incredibly divisive, trying to pit Americans against one another. And what we learned last year in Virginia is that it's these most important kitchen table concerns that when we bring common sense solutions to them, we can bring people together. And when I won last year, it wasn't Republicans against Democrats. We won the independent vote. We had lots of Democrats come with us. And at the end of the day, this is a time when we've got real issues, runaway inflation. I mean, let's be serious. We've got real challenges in inflation. We've got the Fed having to move aggressively in order to slow things down. And Jay Powell came out and said it's going to hurt. And yet we've got our president trying to divide the nation. And I just think it's time to put all that down and to focus on these most important kitchen table concerns that Americans and I know Virginians have, and we can address them with common sense solutions like we're doing in Virginia right now, getting taxes down, funding law enforcement, and focusing on education.
So you reject the president's message last night, obviously, but that was a stark warning from the president of the United States, Governor. Do you believe there are anti-democratic forces in the Republican Party?
I believe that we have people who are searching for leadership. And leadership comes at a time when we need to be focused on these most important issues, not calling each other names and trying to divide the country. I mean, when we look at what's happened over the course of the last couple years, we've seen our economy fall from having been a good one to a real challenged one, inflation running away, crime really challenged. We've got a crisis at the border. We've watched America actually really fall from the international scene in leadership. And I think Americans broadly recognize this. We can see it in the president's job approval ratings. He's got just terrible job approval ratings. And at a time when we're heading into the midterms, what do? You change the narrative. Well, let's go back and talk about the economy. Let's go back and talk about schools. Let's talk about crime. Let's talk about the border. And let's come up with real solutions to these most important issues. Let's not call each other names.
A new poll from Quinnipiac University, Governor, shows 70% of Americans, it was 67% to be exact, think democracy is in danger of collapse. When you see a number that big, do you worry that our institutions are under attack?
Well, I just feel like that entire poll question is an odd one. I mean, America's democracy is not going to collapse. We have seen tough times historically where we've worked through it. This is the most amazing form of government ever envisioned. America is the best country in the world, and we're going to work our way through this. But what it requires is leaders to focus on solutions to those most important challenges for Virginians and for Americans. Again, not calling each other names, not trying to divide us further, but providing a place like we did in Virginia last year for people to come together. And you know what we've done is we've delivered on what we promised, and people are happy. And I think that's what America needs right now is a leader, and our president should step up and put the rhetoric down and focused on solutions to these kitchen table concerns.
Well, speaking of calling names, Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, says that President Biden should apologize to Republicans for referring to MAGA Republicans as semi-fascist. Do you believe the president owes Americans an apology?
I do. I just think the day of name calling should be pressed down at a time when we're searching for leadership. And America needs to lead again. And this is a chance on the international stage and at home for us to recognize that leadership is not a moment to divide, it's a time to bring together.
Governor Youngkin, it was widely noted that Donald Trump supported your candidacy, which was amazingly less than a year ago at this point, but you never appeared on stage with him. Did you create the recipe for Republicans to win in 22 and 24?
Well, our campaign was focused on Virginia, and we campaigned as Virginians. I'm homegrown. I care deeply about the Commonwealth of Virginia and the issues that we ran on crime, on education, on cost of living, on a government that needs to work for us, on protecting our constitutional rights. These are issues that Virginians embraced, and I wanted to make sure that they knew that they had someone running for governor and then serving them as governor focused on them. I do believe that candidates across the nation, Republican governors running, need to focus on these issues because these are the issues that voters are most concerned about. And that's why I'm excited to have some time, not a lot, because I'm very busy here, to support some candidates around the country who I think are in circumstances much like I was in Virginia last year, where there's Republican candidates who can take over a state that's been run by Democrats, and the states have not been performing well, just like Virginia was not performing well, and they can turn it around. And so I think it's a chance for Republican governors to do what Republican governors have been doing, which is leading.
Well, let's talk about the economy for a moment, Governor. We got the jobs report, which is where we started our conversation this hour today. Better than expected. The unemployment rate in Virginia is even lower than the national average at 2.7%. Do you believe it's possible to lower inflation without damaging the job market we have right now?
I think this is a real challenge, and it's one that we are focused on in Virginia every single day. And the key to this is getting people back into the job market. You know, Virginia had labor participation of about 67% prior to the pandemic, and we were ranked 47th in the nation in job recovery coming out of the pandemic. And so we've been very focused on getting people back into the job market. And since January, we've seen 100,000 more jobs taken by Virginians, and that's the fastest growth Virginia's seen in memory. And in fact, we're now ranked in the top 15 in job recovery. But at the end of the day, the key here is the strength of that labor market. And I do have concerns that as the Federal Reserve takes its actions and real concerns about economic growth manifest themselves into boardrooms and, oh, by the way, into families, that we're going to see this labor participation number stall and employment stall. That's why we're working so hard in Virginia in order to bring regulations down, invite new businesses in, and grow the job market. And when companies like Boeing and Raytheon come to Virginia, and Lego comes to Virginia, and Drone Up, who's here, and Hilton's, who's here, grow, it's great for Virginians, but we're continuing to work to keep confidence high that we can navigate through the headwinds that I think the national economic picture, which has been caused by bad policies, has created.
Well, you've obviously got a good story to tell in Virginia, but you come from the business world, Governor, famously at Carlisle, and I wonder, with your background, are you more worried about inflation today or a Fed-induced recession?
Well, they go hand in hand. And it is the inflation that was caused by unbridled spending at the federal government that is forcing the Fed to take these actions. And as a result, they go hand in hand. And if we, of course, didn't have inflation, we wouldn't have the Fed doing what they're doing. And
but here we are, Governor. So what's the big concern? What keeps you up at night? So it sounds like you're more concerned about a recession at this stage.
Oh, I am. I am concerned about economic slowdown. And the antidote to that is jobs and labor participation. And in order to have jobs and labor participation, we've got to keep confidence high in the business community. And we know that. And so I've been encouraged by the confidence that Virginia businesses have been showing in expanding and adding to their labor force. And I think that's the partnership that we've created in Virginia. A business-friendly partnership, lowering regulations, and building a great workforce.
Governor, thank you so much. Joining us from the capital of Richmond, Glenn Youngkin from Virginia. We go now to Mark Crumpton with the first word.
Joe, thank you. Now keeping you up to date with the first word, I'm Mark Crumpton in New York. There have been more than 1,200 deaths across flood-ravaged Pakistan, according to officials there. Children are said to be at special risk of disease and homelessness. Aid has been pouring in from countries including the United Arab Emirates, Uzbekistan, and Qatar. Multiple officials are blaming the unusual monsoon and flooding on climate change. The Group of Seven nations say they will implement a price cap for global purchases of Russian oil. The U.S. hopes that will ease energy market pressures and slash Moscow's overall revenues. The G7 statement did not provide a dollar range for the price cap. In Myanmar, a military-controlled court has sentenced deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi to 3 more years in prison for alleged election fraud. That's the 5th verdict against the Nobel Peace Prize winner since she was ousted in a coup last year. Suu Kyi's prison terms now total 20 years, and she's still awaiting more verdicts. Tropical storm Danielle strengthened into a hurricane this morning. That makes it the first of an unusually quiet storm season. Danielle is not currently said to be a threat to any land. The storm is centered west of the Azores in the North Atlantic. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says the storm's maximum sustained winds were clocked at 75 miles per hour. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Joe?
Mark, thank you. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran now are heating up as Iran claims to have successfully captured and released 2 U.S. sea drones on Thursday. That's according to Iran state TV. This report comes after the U.S. Navy said it foiled an Iranian attempt to seize one of its sail drones in the Persian Gulf. You're seeing video of this now, even as the two sides attempt to negotiate a deal to ease sanctions on Iran. Nothing is coming easily right now, and joining us to talk about it is Mark Esper, former U.S. Secretary of Defense. Secretary, thanks for being with us once again on Bloomberg. How dangerous is this situation right now in the Persian Gulf?
Well, Joe, these are always tricky situations, and you have to keep a close eye on Iran. It's part and parcel of their malevolent behavior that they conduct throughout the entire region, not just the Gulf, but all the way extending into Africa and, of course, into the Indian subcontinent. So the United States Navy, that said, did the right thing in terms of confronting the Iranian Navy and reclaiming that vessel.
The Navy says they used an attack helicopter to intercept that boat, essentially flying over that ship until they released a tow cable. The Iranians say that's a story out of a Hollywood movie. You're obviously taking the Navy's word on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one of our roles in that region is to defend the freedom of movement, the freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. And that's something that Iran challenges constantly. It was during my tenure, of course, that we stood up Operation Sentinel that served to safeguard freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, to protect the free flow of goods and energy and everything else, and to, working jointly with our partners and allies, protect commercial shipping. So it's very important that we preserve that and defend those freedoms, much like we do in the Taiwan Strait.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because this comes only a day after Taiwan chose to shoot down a drone from China that was flying over one of its islands, following days of firing warning shots at this drone. You were just in Taiwan only a couple of months ago. You've met with Taiwan's president, secretary. Is this a new escalation in the Taiwan Strait?
Well, the concern coming after Speaker Pelosi's trip was that China would try and establish a new normal. We still believe that they are trying to do that with greater incursions into Taiwanese-controlled airspace and waters. And this latest incident was the flying of a drone over top a Taiwanese-controlled island just a few miles away from the mainland. And I give Taipei credit for shooting it down. And that, of course, came after multiple warnings, the firing of flares, but they did the right thing to defend their sovereignty. At this point, it's critical that Taipei do a number of other things. We do things to support them. I know the administration recently announced a $1.1 billion arms sales pending. These are all the right new moves to push back on any Chinese attempt to establish a new normal.
Secretary, I'd like to ask you about President Biden's speech to the nation last night. You, in a way, became the face of opposition from inside the Trump administration, as you wrote in your book. Did President Biden speak truth to the so-called MAGA wing of the Republican Party?
Well, look, I share the concerns that he articulated with regard to my party following a single individual who I believe is unfit. I consider myself a Reagan Republican. So what I've been talking about is the importance of us returning to an era where language is less divisive, our narrative, our words are less coarse, and that our leaders bring the American people together and allow us to kind of work together to lead America forward. I don't think President Biden's speech did that. And it was particularly ironic given the fact that he came into office promising to unite the American people and rise above that type of really extreme partisan politics, which I feel is tearing our nation apart. So while I agree with his the narrative that he was trying to put forward, the thesis, I don't think he did it the right way. I don't think it was the proper place to do it. And it came across as very divisive and not unifying.
He's trying to draw a distinction, Secretary, between so-called mainstream Republicans and MAGA Republicans. Is it possible to do that when neither are a monolith?
Well, you're raising all the right questions. I mean, look, there is a divide within the Republican Party. We see it with regard to the candidates that Republicans across the country are putting forward in congressional races or state level races. We see it in the rhetoric between us. And again, I've called for my party, by the way, to look beyond Donald Trump and realize that you can get all the same conservative policy objectives that we like, greater defense spending, lower taxes, less regulation, conservative judges, if you will, without the baggage and the coarseness and the divisiveness that Donald Trump brings. And that's why I think we need to look to a next generation of leaders. And I think you had one on the show just before me, Governor Youngkin. I had nothing to disagree with what he said. I think he's one of those up and coming leaders who could take this party forward in a much more positive way than what we've had the past 4 years.
He was not a fan of the speech last night. Many thanks to Mark Esper, former U.S. Secretary of Defense. Secretary, thank you for being with us here again on Bloomberg. Coming up, we will break down the market reaction to the August payrolls report. That's still ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
When U.S. jobs numbers are released,
Number that's pretty much in line with what Wall Street expected.
Bloomberg brings you crucial data at terminal speed.
315,000 jobs created an optimistic number for the Federal Reserve.
And instant expert analysis.
Dare I say that this might be called a Goldilocks jobs report?
What this does is really push away a lot of the arch gloom.
Maybe leading us toward a soft landing.
The Fed is still going to be debating 50 or 75 basis points.
Nobody covers jobs day like Bloomberg, your global business authority.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, in for David Weston today. We turn to Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta for an update on the markets right now following the unemployment figures and the jobs numbers that we saw this morning. Kriti, happy days are here again?
You know, it kind of looks like that when you look at the eco side of it. But what's interesting for the stock market is, remember, we've had 5 days of losses leading up to the payrolls report. Now, a lot of these jitters, a lot of the anxiety was kind of already baked in. So it's almost, think of it, Joe, as a little bit of a spring here. The idea that when you start to push a spring down, down, down for so long, ultimately it kind of pops back up. And that's what's happening in the stock market today. Up about 0.7% on the S&P 500. The NASDAQ lagging just a touch, but still 0.4% is not necessarily bad for that index that really has been under pressure for some time. The fundamental narrative, Joe, if you want to add this on, is simply that those massive gains in payrolls that we saw last month of over 500,000 bump, well, perhaps that acceleration isn't coming as fast. So yes, even though we had a positive payrolls number, perhaps the inflation delta, as Cameron Kreis over on the Markets Live team put it, is actually slowing down. The acceleration is coming back down. Perhaps some of the efforts that the Federal Reserve has put forward towards the economy, perhaps they are working.
What's the impact on the bond market here today on this, Kriti? There's been so much concern about interest rates, and we're back to the 75 basis point assumption, I guess, for next week.
You know, I'm going to make the same argument for the bond market that I just made for the stock market, because once again, you have to look at the lead up towards the economic data. And if you actually look at some of the information within the jobs report, the labor participation rate, for example, which did come in higher, but then you're looking at hourly wages, for example, on a real basis, they actually came in lower. So I think from a fundamental standpoint, you do have a little bit of that flight to safety where you are pulling the yields lower as treasuries catch that bid. But once again, Joe, in the lead up to this, you've had yields just go higher, 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 with even the 2-year yield hitting 3.5%. So that is going to be significant. The question is the market momentum you're seeing today really indicative of the payrolls report? And right now, the jury's still out.
The jury is still out. Many thanks to Kriti Gupta, for all of the analysis throughout the week. Coming up, we speak with Brian Deese, economic advisor at the White House. That's still ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew, in for David Weston. Labor Secretary Marty Walsh says he is confident that demand for workers is strong enough to withstand the Federal Reserve's attempts to cool the economy. He talked about it earlier today on Bloomberg. Here's what he had to say.
When you look at the job openings in America right now, I think we're going to be consistently strong as we move forward here. I think we're going to continue to people be going back to work, having the unemployment, having the labor participation rate getting bigger. I think that's important. I think what's going to reduce the inflation is obviously the Inflation Reduction Act will help us on that. The gas prices continue to come down will help us on that. And then, you know, I think the biggest unknown is going to be what's happening with Russia and Ukraine.
This is what Chairman Powell said last week. He said higher interest rates, slower growth and a softer labour market condition will bring down inflation. They will also bring some pain to households and businesses. He said this: a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain. You saying you disagree with that, Secretary Walsh?
No, you know, I think that the chairman certainly has a lot more knowledge on this than I do. But my concern is what I don't want to see is people being laid off. I want to continue seeing people go back to work, people being able to earn good wages. I think that, you know, overall, and again, we're in a very interesting time when it comes to our economy. Nothing that's been predicted or no indicators that we've talked about in the last 2 years is like any other time in the history of our country. So I think that, you know, as we think about inflation coming down, there's lots of reasons for why inflation went up, and it's not the same old pressures of the past.
U.S. Labor Secretary Marty Walsh speaking earlier today on Bloomberg from the Labor Department. August jobs numbers out today. As we have been reporting, payrolls up more than expected, 315,000 in August. The jobless rate also a surprise. It went up unexpectedly to 3.7%. As the participation rate climbed, this is, of course, seen as good news with more people entering the job market, more people looking for work. Let's get some more context in a deep dive with Brian Deese, National Economic Council Director. He has the ear of the president on all things economic. And Brian, it's great to have you back. I know your job is to tell me that the president's policies are working, and this is a good news report for the administration. But I wonder about this inflation argument, Brian. If we're going to beat inflation, does the job market have to weaken?
Well, it's great to be here, and I think that one of the things you highlighted about this report is important in answering that question, which is in particular the moves that we saw around the labor force. You know, one of the things that we want to see economically, that all of us want to see, is more people getting into the labor market, obviously getting jobs, but also looking for jobs as well. So what we saw today, obviously the headline, 315,000 jobs, that's solid. But we also saw the largest increase in the labor force participation rate this year. And that puts labor force participation for prime age workers back near the historic highs for the last decade, close to where it was right before the pandemic hit. We saw, for example, that women's labor force participation for working age women actually exceeded pre-pandemic levels. That is the kind of labor market progress that we want to see to try to demonstrate that we can actually bring prices down in this economy without having to give up all of the economic gains that we've made. So I guess what I would say is this report, not only in the headline, but so underneath, is quite encouraging in terms of the transition that we want to see.
Do we have a sense of what is bringing people back to the job market? This has been a question mark since COVID, essentially. As you see participation rise, is it inflation that's causing more people to look for work?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and obviously I think it's a variety of different factors. I think first and foremost, it's the strength of the labor market. The job openings that are out there mean that people have more opportunities than they have in recent memory to take jobs, and jobs that better fit their skill profile, give them more opportunities in the labor market. That's something that pulls people in. But I think there's other things as well. The decline in gas prices we've seen over the summer makes, as we go into the fall commuting season, post-summer commuting season, makes commuting a little bit easier. And I also think the progress that we've seen on COVID, I don't think we should underestimate the degree to which we're going into a school year that is the first stable school year. And obviously, COVID is still with us, and we have to still remain focused. But parents and families that are trying to sort out their lives have a bit more stability now, given that schools are open, and certainly we expect that to continue to be the case. So I think all of those things are factoring in.
You mentioned gas prices, Brian, down about 80 days, I believe, straight. It's been quite a trend here. Can you tell our listeners and viewers confidently that gas prices have peaked?
Look, the world's an uncertain place, and so what I can tell you is that gas prices have fallen for 80 days. That's very unusual. It's certainly unusual through the summer driving season, where we, because of both regulations and demand, you typically don't see that to the case. That's down about $1.20, so that's about $125 for a typical two-car family. What I can also tell you is that if you look at markets and where markets are pricing going forward, as you would expect gas prices to continue to come down as well. We need to underscore there are serious global risks in our economy right now. Obviously, energy markets face those global risks, and so none of us should take solace that things are going to be stable going forward. We need to continue to maintain vigilance around that issue. That's why, for example, we had the G7 announcement that we had today about the price cap on Russian oil. But certainly this progress, as unprecedented as it is, where the markets are today, signal that we should continue to see some further fall.
Well, realizing that things can shift under our feet, Brian, while we've been talking, we've got a breaking news headline on the Bloomberg. Gazprom says Nord Stream will remain shut down after a technical issue. We know that it's going to be a painful winter in Europe. Does the United States have spare energy capacity, or at least enough spare capacity to help?
Well, we're doing everything that we can. One of the key issues is around trying to get natural gas to Europe, and the president made a decision and direction several months ago, in March, in fact, to say we need to both increase our export capacity on natural gas to the degree that we can, given that there are infrastructure limitations, but then redirect wherever we can shipments to Europe. That's more than doubled the amount of U.S. natural gas that's getting to Europe, and that's had a mitigating impact. We're going to keep working on that piece and keep working closely with our European allies around things like the price cap proposal, which I know we've talked about in the past, measures and policies that achieve our shared goal with our European partners, which is to maximize pain on Putin while maintaining global supply as best we can and positioning and minimizing the pain in our domestic economy. Certainly that's true for the United States, but we're also very cognizant of that for Europe as well.
How about here at home as we head for the winter heating season, Brian? These concerns in the Northeast about distillates like heating oil and, of course, the price of diesel, that has not fallen the way we've seen gasoline. What should families be bracing for come winter?
Well, certainly it's something that we follow very closely on a daily and weekly basis in terms of inventories and inventory levels around the country. Obviously, the focus right now is on the East Coast and the Northeast, where we do have historically low inventory levels of refined product, but in particular diesel. From a policy perspective, we have been very focused on staying on high alert on tools that we have not deployed, but we are certainly prepared to, including the Northeast Home Heating Reserve that is in that region and that is comprised of diesel. I think that, what I would say in terms of the outlook for American families is that the principal energy cost that people face is the gasoline and what it costs to fill up at the pump. And there's really good news. As I said, there's about $125 a month in savings, and futures suggest that should keep coming down. And we are going to stay vigilant around making sure that supply is available and we don't have any break in terms of inventories and supply as we head into the winter months in the U.S.
Brian, thank you. Brian Deese, Director of the White House National Economic Council. Appreciate your insights today on Bloomberg. Coming up, Lauren Goodwin of New York Life on the August jobs numbers. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Joe Matthew in for David Weston. Thanks for joining us. We have breaking news today as Gazprom announces just moments ago the Nord Stream pipeline will remain shut. It was supposed to reopen tomorrow. For more, we bring in Simon Casey, energy and commodities team leader here at Bloomberg. Simon, how significant is this development?
It's hugely significant for Europe, for its energy supplies, energy security. And look, it's something of a surprise in that this morning we had seen information from the operator of the pipeline, Gazprom, suggesting they had orders. The gas was about to ship as expected. Tomorrow morning, they'd scheduled this short-term shutdown for what they described as maintenance. Now that's not going ahead. There's some technical issue, and we're trying to find out more details. And, you know, Joe, this is just like what we've seen earlier this summer, where we've seen the pipeline parts of the capacity taken out for maintenance. We've seen pieces of machinery replaced, and then it's almost like Russia is to a certain extent toying with Europe here and disrupting the flow of gas into Western Europe.
Bloomberg's Simon Casey, thanks for checking in here as we just got this headline crossing from Gazprom. Much more on this throughout the day on Bloomberg TV and radio. Keep your eye on the terminal as we learn more as well. August jobs numbers topping estimates, as we've told you this hour. For more, we bring in Lauren Goodwin, economist and multi-asset portfolio strategist with New York Life Investments. It's great to have you with us here, Lauren. Does this ensure, since everyone seems to be so pleased with this report, does it ensure 75 basis points?
No one should be surprised at 75 basis points, Joe, and happy Friday. Look, this was a good report, perfectly Goldilocks, more or less what was expected. And so we're seeing a pretty subdued market reaction today. But all systems go ahead for the Federal Reserve. Now, whether you get 75 basis points or 50 is going to depend on that inflation number in a couple of weeks. But I put it at better than coin toss that we see 75.
We just spoke with Brian Deese from the White House and got the angle on this from the administration. They've been very optimistic about this job market. The labor secretary essentially saying he's not concerned about Federal Reserve rate hikes. But is it possible, Lauren, to beat inflation without bringing this job market under control, without actually having a higher unemployment rate?
It's going to be really challenging. And while I'm sympathetic to the perspective that the labor market is great and there's not much to worry about, there's a couple of reasons why we're concerned about the path ahead, even if that's not the case for the next few months. The first is that the labor market is a lagging indicator, meaning that when it comes to forecasting recessions or more economic duress ahead, it usually tends to be behind the curve as opposed to ahead of the curve. Now, the second reason that this report gave me some reason for concern is that when you're thinking about whether inflation will get entrenched in the economy, what you're really looking for is wage growth or a wage price spiral. That's where the stickiness of price pressures come from. And we're not seeing really any abatement in wage pressures, especially in services, where we expect further growth ahead in the next few months.
So all that said, you expressed concern on your podcast a couple of months ago at this point, concern about a possible stagflationary environment. Are we in that already?
We're not in that environment in terms of the data, in terms of what headline growth numbers say. But for the average household, we've been in a stagflation environment already for some time. The cost pressures that households are seeing, even with stronger wage pressure, just not keeping up. This has been a really challenging environment. And that same idea we're seeing manifest in the investment environment as well. And what I mean by that is that even though recession risks are rising, even though growth risks are rising, it is challenging to rely on traditionally defensive strategies like cash or government bonds when inflation's running above 8%.
Right.
And so instead, investors have to stay invested and think of ways to keep gains on inflation to avoid an erosion of purchasing power even further.
As a multi-asset strategist, are you waiting for stocks to revisit the lows of June before you start nibbling again?
We're not. We've been very tactical in this market. And while I do expect further volatility ahead and for us to test new lows in the coming months, it's very difficult to time those types of movements. And so instead, we're A, being very tactical, and B, focusing on investments that can help build resilience to some of this volatility. So that can include asset classes that contribute further cash flow to a portfolio. It can be dividend payers, and taking targeted bets within a more defensive overall positioning to ensure keeping up again with that inflation impulse.
Thanks for sharing ideas with us. Lauren Goodwin of New York Life Investments here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, our big politics panel will speak with Democratic New York former Congressman Joe Crowley and former Republican Virginia Representative Barbara Comstock. Comstock and Crowley on everything we've heard so far this hour on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in for David Weston. President Biden's address in Philadelphia last night, driving the conversation across the country today, came on the heels of a new poll that found 67% of Americans think democracy is unraveling. This is from Quinnipiac University, with both Democrats and Republicans agreeing that democracy, that the nation is in danger. Let's bring in our panel now. Former Democratic New York Congressman Joe Crowley, along with former Republican Virginia Representative Barbara Comstock. I think we can franchise this. Comstock and Crowley, welcome to Balance of Power. It's great to have you both here. We've heard a lot this hour, and I want to start with the president's speech last night. The audience, who was he actually talking to? I'll ask you as the Democrat, Joe Crowley. Was it mainstream Republicans or independents who he fears are about to vote Republican?
I think it's to everyone. I think it really was reinforcing this notion or idea that, yeah, there is a challenge. There's an existential threat to our democracy. More specifically, I do think, though, that he was talking to people who share that concern. And that is the majority of the American people. But also speaking to hope and to the resilience of our democracy, and that people need to be engaged. People need to reject that form of extremism that is existing within, more often than not, the Republican far right at this point when it comes to those issues.
Barbara, there's been some outrage among Republicans since this speech. In a pre-buttal, in fact, Kevin McCarthy said the president should apologize for calling MAGA Republicans fascists. He said that Joe Biden has, in fact, hurt the soul of the nation. Earlier this hour, Glenn Youngkin, the governor of your state of Virginia, also condemned the fiery rhetoric, if I can use that term, we heard from Joe Biden last night. Are you part of that chorus, or did Joe Biden say what needed to be said?
Listen, I'm not a MAGA Republican, and I think Donald Trump is doing a lot of harm to the Republican Party, but I think he's doing a lot of harm to the country. This week, Donald Trump demanded that he be unconstitutionally restored as president.
Yes.
He also said he was going to pardon many of these felons who have been put in jail, and many more who are going to be for January 6th for beating cops within an inch of their lives, people who were out there screaming to hang Mike Pence and did worse. And he said he wanted to pardon them, these violent people. Yeah. And he's the one, these are the kind of people who said, they wanted, we also have, people who said we want to defund the FBI and all of this violence, which he has encouraged. And then you said, hey, and you've also had senators who said, if Donald Trump is indicted, there's going to be violence.
Right.
So while I didn't think the speech that
Speaking of
Joe Biden,
fiery rhetoric.
Yeah. So I think Joe Biden would have been better to give particulars of what he was talking about, because I think Donald Trump's rhetoric is dangerous, and those who have said these things, like let's say what Kari Lake, who's running for governor in Arizona, said. She said she has put a stake through the heart of the McCain machine. Yeah. Now, how are you going to bring people together in Arizona if you're attacking a beloved senator in Arizona? How are you going to bring people together?
Sounds like you feel the timing of this speech might have been right.
So I think he should have probably highlighted, say, Doug Mastriano, who's running for governor in Pennsylvania, who was dressing up in Confederate uniforms recently, who's associated with anti-Semites and 3%ers, and of course, he's running behind in Pennsylvania because he's certainly not bringing to get people together. So I think what he was talking about, the authoritarians in the Republican Party, the people who aren't bringing people together, and who are attacking Republicans like me, he would have been better served if he had pointed out the exact rhetoric of those Republicans, because it's very dangerous what those Republicans are doing to the Republican Party. And those Republicans who want to bring back Trumpism, where Biden was very successful is he's putting Trump in the front seat of that car that is driving towards November. And every day you're in that front seat, Trump's going to drive that car right off the ledge.
How do you delineate between so-called MAGA Republicans and mainstream Republicans? Is that what the president is asking? To Barbara's point, should he have been more specific about what those even mean?
I think everyone's open to, some criticism in terms of the delivery. I thought overall, this is not a speech that any president really wants to give. Any true American-loving president does not want to have to give this kind of speech. That the enemy is not overseas, that the enemy might be from within, that's scary. The label issue, I think there's a clear distinction between the MAGA wing of the Republican Party and, moderate Republicans, people who may have voted for Donald Trump because they may not have liked how he presented himself, but they may have liked some of the things he did. And I recognize that as a Democrat. But I also recognize what happened on 1/6. I recognize that there was an insurrection. I recognize that Donald Trump has said that he's considering pardoning those who were involved in that event. That is troubling. That is actually saying that someone who's convicted of sedition, of overturning the United States, that the president, former president of the United States, if I'm reelected, I'm going to pardon them. That is scary stuff.
But see, Mike Pence has pointed out that, stop attacking the FBI.
We're out of time, unfortunately. What's a greater risk to this nation? The threat against democracy or inflation? Barbara?
Well, I think the American people have spoken loudly. The threat against democracy.
Threat against democracy.
Threat against democracy.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Comstock and Crowley. Excellent with us. Thank you both for being with us on Balance of Power. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online, and I'll meet you on the radio for Hour 2. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.